Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Into the Wild. Today, I have with me Dr. David Bunn. Dr. Bunn was the director of the California Department of Conservation from 2015 to 2019 and has held roles at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And as a policy consultant, he was a project director and a researcher at the One Health Institute at UC Davis School of Vet Med, and he also co-founded the American Trash Management and served as the environmental director at the California Public Interest Research Group and as the executive director of the California Agrarian Project. So, welcome to the podcast, Dr. Bunn.
Glad to be here. Thanks for
Um,
asking me.
so today's topic we've decided to talk about is climate change and a little bit on public health in terms of the upcoming avian influenza and what we can learn from the COVID-19 pandemic about these issues. So I'm just gonna jump right in. So the first question that that I had for Dr. Bunn is, what exactly is climate change for people who don't really know or understand the science behind it, and why should we care about it?
Well, the simple answer is it's really the product of our society for generations now burning fossil fuels for energy, primarily burning coal, gas, oil. But the two compounds we're most worried about that cause, that are released into the atmosphere that cause our globe to warm are CO2 and methane. And basically, when they're accumulated in the atmosphere, when the sun irradiates to the earth, it kind of serves as like greenhouse. They call it a greenhouse effect, which keeps the heat in. And the concern is, as as the world is heating up now, much more rapidly than it has for thousands of years, that it's going to cause significant climate change, and that could lead to more floods, more fires, as we're already seeing.
Absolutely. And what would you say in terms of using the term global warming? Global warming, I mean, would that be considered the same, or is climate change the more politically correct term to use?
Well, really, one's causing the other. So global warming is, the atmosphere on the globe. I mean, Earth is heating up, and that's caused by this accumulation of gases. And but they cause climate change. They're causing. And when we say climate change, a lot of people confuse, I think, weather with climate change.
Mhm.
So we're not talking about next year's weather or last year's weather. What we're talking about are long-term averages of global temperature. So, for example, when you have long-term averages of change, you see things like our glaciers melt away. So
Mhm.
even, for example, 30 years ago or 40 years ago, when I worked in the Serengeti, you know, um, Kilimanjaro had a big white cap of snow on it. Well, now if you, excuse me, fly over it, you'll see that a lot of that there's very little left.
Yes.
Can you pause?
Yes, I can. Okay. And that's thank you so much for the explanation. And I also wanted to mention that in previous episodes, one of our guest speakers did mention that nature or certain organisms are unable to keep up with the rapid changes in climate. Is that accurate? What would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's multiple environments where if an animal's kind of already kind of the extreme of that environment, if it gets more extreme, they might disappear. The species would disappear. So, for example, alpine species,
Hmm.
they depend on, alpine conditions, but if it warms up, they likely could disappear as a species.
Okay. Thank you so much for that explanation. And you had also mentioned that you had worked in environmental policy, and from the political side of it, what exactly does environmental policy target specifically, and what does it mean to be an environmental policy writer?
Well, it's very, very broad. I mean, everything from dealing with, say, pesticides and making sure they're safe and not hurting the environment to emissions from our automobiles so that, the compounds being emitted from the exhaust is not hurting people living in cities. Everything to conserving land for native, lands for species, natural lands. I mean, so it's a very, very broad topic. In California, for example, if you just take our Natural Resources Agency, within it are 20 boards, commissions, and departments. And then we also have another agency, the California Environmental Protection Agency, that has another, six departments. And so everything from the air board to the water board to the energy commission to the forestry department, et cetera. There's a lot of different areas of environment. And so policy, you could end up environmental policy people working everything from, you know, chemicals and toxics in the city to trying to conserve lands in the wild.
Interesting. So I didn't know that it was that there was actually this many commissions involved until you just mentioned it. And I think that's important for people to learn that the government has these things in place so that we don't overuse or destroy certain parts of nature. And I think it's important to understand how environmental policy works. From my understanding, it's not just some lawyer somewhere just going to sue some random company because they violated something. It's much more broader than that. There's much more that goes into making environmental policy. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, also policy is made in legislative processes which allow all stakeholders to come to the table. So if you're trying to negotiate, for example, pesticide policy, you will have pesticide manufacturing companies, you will have farmers, you will have water quality environmentalists, you will have uh, people concerned about farm worker health and safety. So you have a lot of people will come to the table to debate and discuss the policy to see that it achieves a goal, but doesn't go too far and make it difficult, for example, to grow food.
Okay. And I do know that in terms of the environmental policy that our university, UC Davis, is involved with, they also involve Native American communities, which I think is fantastic, especially when it comes to the removal of the Klamath dams and sturgeon stock maintenance,
Hmm.
which, yeah, I thought was awesome. And I actually used to work for that lab.
That's
Um,
great.
so I also wanted to ask you, what are some of the biggest challenges in government that governments face when implementing policies to combat climate change? Yeah.
Well, there's a couple things. One is a lot of policies are expensive, or they, cost businesses money or entities money. And so, often there's resistance to policy because of the expense of implementing them. The other is very often enforcement is difficult, and enforcement is expensive. Again, how do you, either incentivize people to do the right thing that is good for the environment, and if not incentivize, how do you potentially penalize companies from doing the wrong thing? So all of those pieces, enacting law is probably, although it can be difficult, is probably the most difficult, I mean, the easiest part, and then actually implementation effectively to where it does what the policymakers imagine is the more difficult part.
Absolutely. And I did not write this down, but I just wanted to ask you because it just popped in my head. What role do ecosystem services play in this policy procedure? Do
Well,
like
they play a huge role, and I would say over the last 30 years, particularly, we've come to recognize and even put into the laws recognizing the value of ecosystem services because they have real economic value. So, for example, right now, I would say water agencies and companies up and down the state invest in improving water quality high in the Sierra now.
Mhm.
They're spending money to restore meadows, creeks, rivers, so that they don't have a lot of sediment runoff and that the water quality is better when it reaches our reservoirs that eventually supplies drinking water. So that's not something we recognized years ago, and now we do, and people spend money because it's cheaper to keep it clean than to try and clean it up later. And the same is true with air quality. We sometimes we enact various taxes to pay for things. In the case of a lot of air quality, it's actually put on the emitters. So there's laws passed as saying, if you're producing one thing or another, you cannot emit certain levels of pollutants. And that kind of activity almost always requires some form of enforcement.
Okay. And never mind. I forgot what I was gonna say, but okay, so because in classes they do teach us about ecosystem services, and I think it's also important for people who are listening to understand that the environment does provide us with per se free. things that we can use, like I don't know how to word it properly, but there are things that the environment does for us that are basically free, which if we had to pay for, it would cost us billions of dollars. And I think a good example you had mentioned was water filtration. And I do remember learning in one of my classes that they do use the forests near the state of New York to conduct water filtration, and it's saving them a lot of money.
Yeah.
And removing those forests for other purposes would actually cost the state more money. So yeah.
No, it's an important part of our economy and not usually adequately recognized in economic analyses.
Yes, they did discuss with us how it is difficult to quantify mathematically in terms of dollars how much money exactly the environment would be saving for us. I mean, you can't like measure how many trees are like in a certain area and then just quantify how much like oxygen they're producing. That would take forever, but yeah.
Well, in the healthcare sector, there's been more science that quantifies for the levels of pollutants released into the air. And in how many additional cases of asthma, say in
Hmm.
children, that would cause, and then what the healthcare costs are. So we have much better numbers today,
Okay.
basically what the healthcare impacts are versus protecting the environment to begin with, and providing clean an ecosystem service, the most basic of which is providing clean air for us to breathe. And if we impede that clean air or pollute it, we're diminishing that, and basically those costs are showing up somewhere else.
Oh, okay. Also, I want people to learn from this that please plant trees and flowers or anything you can. I think gardening and planting trees is really important for the environment, even if it's just a hobby and it's for fun. And I guess another question I had is how can environmental policy support both climate change, resilience, and preservation of ecosystems? I think we already touched on this, but like a little bit more deeper.
Well, there's a lot of features of the natural environment that give us resilience. So, for example, if you have good, healthy watersheds, that, for example, reduces the likelihood of floods. If you
Mhm.
have healthy floodplains where we haven't built houses all the way up to the edge of rivers, but allowed when there is a flood, we basically protected areas that actually are natural floodplains. So those kinds of things that we can protect or even restore. Sometimes we've lost floodplain or for example, in tropical areas, as you mentioned, like mangrove forests. Well, mangrove forests are very, very protective of the shoreline to storms and reduce the amount of damage from storms. And I was recently doing some work in Guyana, and they have actually added back mangrove about a mile thick around the ocean front in front of the capital city, and that basically is to be a buffer against
Yeah.
hurricane storms.
Hmm.
Uh, and so that people have recognized those forests that we tore down actually had this value we
Yes.
didn't recognize, and now they're spending money to restore them.
Hmm. Yes, I've also heard that mangroves protect against typhoons and hurricanes. Um, and yeah, I think with humans, I think it's like once it's lost, then we realize the value of it, and then all of a sudden we want it back. But everything costs money at the end of the day, which is the sad
That's
part.
true.
Um, so again, my next question is, for people who are climate change skeptics, or per se, what are the big misconceptions about climate change, and how can we bridge the gap? And this is a very broad question.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think probably 98% of the top scientists on climate are in agreement.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, I think news is not scientifically done because
Yes.
they'll interview somebody who says one thing, one scientist, top scientist, but they always want to go get the contrary view. It's not like they take a statistical sample of, say, 30 scientists and ask them what they think, because the odds are if they asked 30, they'd all agree that
Yes.
climate change was a problem. So I think just people need to do their homework if they want to, but I think they need to listen to the kind of consensus among scientists and be leery about, I would call it outliers. And outliers, basically, there are scientists who will make a living, saying what the oil industries would love them to say. And frankly, you can travel the world and go to lots of conferences and have your way paid if you have that contrary view that's the opposite of, say, the vast majority of the scientists, because there are strong economic interests in that voice, because industry would like to share. So I just think, if people do the homework and they look at the broad range of scientific perspectives, they'll see that there is pretty good consensus on a lot of this.
Awesome. Um, and in terms of also just educating the general population, a lot of these people who don't believe in climate change are skeptical of listening to scientists for various reasons. And again, how do we just educate them about basic biology or basic chemistry? Because I do know people, and there are some people that I know personally, in fact, who are climate change deniers, and it is very difficult to talk to them about, for example, a rising ocean doesn't necessarily mean that ice caps are melting, but that a water molecule is expanding, which means there's more water. How would you talk to these people?
Well, ice caps melting, that's one example where you can actually verify it, and we do. So it's not like we're saying that's occurring and maybe it's happening, maybe it isn't.
Hmm.
We know they're melting. We can
Yeah.
measure it. And so it's a measurable thing.
Hmm.
I would just ask people, is your denial of climate change, is it politically driven? Is it because one political group or another decided that's what they'd like it to be, or one conservative voice versus another, or is it really based on some kind of scientific
Yes.
understanding and looking, into facts? And again, I think it's all of our responsibilities to really seek out
Yes.
truth. And that sometimes is not easy in this world, particularly in social media, where most of what's on social media is false. Um, and so I just think, it's our responsibility to be serious and look for the facts and know that they should not be political issues. For example, bird flu. I mean,
Mhm.
unfortunately, not bird flu, but say COVID. COVID became very political.
Yes.
And it's usually issues like health don't get so political. Sometimes they do.
Mhm.
But usually they're not. And usually Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals will come together and say, how do we
Yeah.
solve this problem? And we'll listen to the scientists and we do what we need to do.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, in this COVID case, a lot of politicians in some countries chose to make it very political, which then you had people opposed to putting on masks, people who used to would be fine with vaccination. All of a sudden now they're like, opposed to vaccination. Well, that wasn't based on science. It was based on false information they've seen on social media, or just the fact that they want to be consistent with their party, whatever. But this is very dangerous. So, for example, in the United States, there's been analyses
Yeah.
done. We were one of the worst. Here we have the best science, healthcare, and
Mhm.
one of the worst performing countries in the world in terms of number of deaths
Yeah.
per capita in the world. And that wasn't because we didn't have the science or the hospitals. It was literally because it was politicized,
Mhm.
and a lot of people chose not to be vaccinated. And we estimate that because of the resistance to vaccination, probably at least 230,000 people died additional
Oh my
uh,
God.
because of that failure to vaccinate. And of the fact that we're generally, there was opposition to masks and other measures and frankly, the government wasn't quite ready to even do that effectively anyways. But we could have, in the US, 1.2 million people died from COVID.
Mhm.
And I would say if we had a good program based on science to do surveillance for potential outbreaks and then respond appropriately, we would have saved half of that 1.2 million.
Mhm.
And so to put in perspective, 500,000 lives potentially could have been saved. And if that's more than, have died in all the wars we've
Yeah.
fought, I know people are very willing to go out and fight to protect our country. Really, when a pandemic or an outbreak, they need to think of it in those terms. What would they do to protect their neighbor, their friends, et cetera? It's not a lot to ask to follow public health recommendations,
Mhm.
which are very, very minor compared to other things we typically do to protect
Yes.
our country. So,
And I absolutely agree with you on all of those topics. And um what I was gonna say was I really do think that the pandemic was a lesson for us, especially when it comes to avian flu, which is what I wanted to ask you about next. And I mean, climate policy is addressing global challenges, but it's also important to consider how climate change influences the spread of infectious diseases, and also how humans deal with these new biological issues that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. With that in mind, how does environmental policy and sustainable agriculture intersect with the rise of avian flu? And I'm asking this especially because because I want to get into veterinary school. So a lot of vets that I work with are currently talking about avian flu, especially large animal vets, which is what I'm interested in. Especially because cows are now catching it, and I believe feral cats, poultry, and domesticated cats. What are your thoughts on the policy and things that we can do to alleviate this?
Well, first of all, I think it's an important field to get into, so I'm glad to hear you. That's the field you're interested in because one of the things that the UC Davis team that headed up the vet school headed a consortium worldwide that looked at viruses of pandemic potential in wild animals crossing into wildlife or livestock,
Yes.
crossing into humans. And they did that in 30 countries. And what they've learned from that is that with climate change, what we're seeing is we expect an increased amount of diseases emerging and crossing from wildlife to humans. It's coupled with that and habitat loss, where we're going into forests humans have ever been and cutting down, old growth trees in the tropics. So these reasons combined, we do expect to see disease outbreaks more frequent. So I would just say that again, we need to we need to educate the public at large enough to where they can make smart decisions when we do have outbreaks. Because what we've learned is that decision process by the public is as important as any other aspect
Hmm.
of the scientific response to an outbreak. If the public doesn't, go along with recommendations, the death rate will be much higher. And you mentioned bird flu. Bird flu has the potential to be far worse than COVID. So
H5N1.
COVID, I think that we estimated the number of about 1 in 100 people that got COVID in the United States died
Hmm.
one in every 100 cases.
Hmm.
And bird flu could be 5 or 10%. It could be considerably higher and make COVID look like a practice. And so that's why it's so serious. And yet the conditions right now are perfect for COVID, for bird flu to become a pandemic. It's widespread in wild populations of
Yeah.
wild waterfowl. It's widespread into commercial poultry. It's widespread in dairy. And
Hmm.
as you mentioned, it's actually crossed over into dozens of
Yes.
species of mammals and other bird species. So
Yeah.
the conditions are right for it to do one of two things we call either mutate or we call reassort,
Hmm.
and then in a way that it causes it to become a virus that spreads easy from human to spread easy from human to human. Right now, it has two of the three factors that are necessary for a pandemic. One, it has to cross over from wildlife to
Hmm.
human. Two, it has to cause illness, death and illness. And three, it has to be able to pass easily from human to human. That third step, it hasn't
Yes.
mutated to achieve yet, but that could happen at any moment.
Hmm.
And if that happens, then we're going to have another big pandemic on our hands worldwide. And
Hmm.
it's already around the world, so it will go around the world quickly. And the only defense, frankly, is wide scale vaccination, human vaccination.
Okay. So
And
prevention,
we're
essentially.
not ready for it because in the United States, we've only produced right now about 5 million doses, which is less than enough to even give to our healthcare workers.
Oh my God. Okay. Wow. And I guess so since I feel like avian flu is one of those diseases where you see a crossover between the agricultural side of animal biology and the wildlife side of animal biology. So what would you tell to a farmer per se, or what are like I guess the food science implications of this since we consume a lot of these animals that have now caught the flu?
Well, if you're a poultry vet, one of the things you want to evaluate is the poultry farms you're working with, are they near a waterfowl area? And unfortunately, in California, many of them are because in our Central Valley, the entire valley is a waterfowl area, and that is what's called the Pacific Flyway. And
Hmm.
so you want to make extra step up your biosecurity efforts so that your domestic flock does not get exposed to ducks or geese or even droppings from ducks and geese. And the other side of it, on the human related side from a farmer perspective, is you don't want to take this into your home,
Yeah.
into your kitchen. You don't want farm workers and poultry workers and dairy workers to take wear their dirty clothes home that have the virus on them and take it home to to their house where their family could get it. But even on a broader concern of that is one of the ways this virus could become pandemic is that I mentioned reassortment as one of the more likely ways. And what that is, if somebody has seasonal flu, let's say a worker has seasonal flu,
Mhm.
and then they go to work and they're exposed to bird flu,
Mhm.
that they become the mixing vessel, their
Oh,
body, for the two viruses to share segments. And so that can happen inside of a cow. It could happen inside of a
yeah.
person.
Oh,
So what we want to do is minimize those opportunities for people to have both types of flu at the same time.
yes. And Dr. Patesky, the poultry vet at the school, UC Davis School of Vet Med, who's currently one of the top researchers on avian flu, did mention at the One Health Symposium last year that partially the reason why we have this issue is because we've drained all of the original sources of water in the Central Valley. Is that true?
Yeah, most of the entire Central Valley was a wetland. And we
Yes.
had millions and millions of ducks and geese. And when, 200 years ago, they said you could shoot a shot, if you could shoot a shotgun in the air, you could get multiple
Yes.
birds in one shot. And that's really, that's true. But so the historic areas these birds still come to, and we flood them up. So farmers actually in the rice growing regions, when they've harvested the rice, they then flood the fields, and that provides most of the habitat for ducks and geese in the Central Valley are actually on rice lands, and that's critical for their survival. So the Central Valley, we intentionally flood areas where there historically was marshlands and water for waterfowl.
Hmm.
Um, but those exist up and down the valley, and they actually exist near where we do have poultry farms. So
Hmm.
that's why there is this opportunity for the virus to share between wild birds
Hmm.
and domestic birds.
Okay. So it is a One Health issue at the end of the day.
Absolutely. I
Yes.
mean, you need to look at all of them together. I would say any kind of pandemic virus is really a One Health issue because you have the human, wildlife, livestock, environmental factors that really all need to be considered collectively to have the best chance of responding to the virus.
Thank you so much for explaining that. The second question I had was in terms of species jumps. So, um, occasionally my friends will send me links to things, or my family will send me links to things about avian flu, like, oh my God, it's in the milk now, or it's like in cows. So I just wanted to talk about species jumps, what that means. You had mentioned that the virus mutates or is now able to infect another animal. Could you elaborate more on what it means for there to be a species jump?
Well, it just means that the virus it has a shape. There's a couple of proteins on the virus that, to infect another animal, they have to be adapted to where they actually can attach to the tissue of that animal, usually in the lungs. And so, uh, if you might have, like I say, waterfowl are typically a reservoir species for
Mhm.
bird flu. That's why we call it bird flu, that they can have the virus and it doesn't necessarily make
Yes.
them sick. But then if let's say they land on a dairy and the cow is exposed to it, the feces are on the ground from the birds, and the cows pick it up. That cow, if that virus wasn't adapted to potentially attach to tissues in that cow, the cow wouldn't be affected by it. But if it's the RNA in that virus has adapted and created the proteins that allow it to
Yeah.
attach, then it can infect that cow. And then the question is, how virulent? Will it make the cow sick? And then obviously in bird flu case, yes, it's making cows
Yes,
very
it
sick.
has.
So that's again, but it's very species specific. But the fact that it's now crossed over into multiple mammalian species, which makes it which is close to humans, right? Because we're mammals.
Yeah.
So it actually has wiped out like sea lion, one
Sea
species
lions.
of sea lions in South America. It's in cats. It's in skunks. These it's not far away from being adapted to attach to a human.
And since again, humans drink milk, we eat beef, we eat chicken, from a consumer level, how concerned should we be, as people who consume animal products? Does this mean we just cook our meat more, or like, I don't know.
Well, I would say if you know the animal has avian flu, I would just avoid, we can afford not to eat it, not handle it. The main issue, we taught this. I actually ran the avian flu training and response that was funded by USAID
Hmm.
for about 6 years in East and West Africa.
Hmm.
And people were so poor that they couldn't even afford, say, just to bury their birds if they were sick. So we
Hmm.
actually even taught how to handle birds that we knew had avian flu and handle them in a way they could cook them and still eat them. So the key is here when you're handling any of these things, whether it be a dairy product or poultry, it's if it's raw. So that's why we say it's not a good
Yes.
time. Don't drink raw milk right now. But if it's
Pasteurize
been
it.
pasteurized, you don't really need to worry about it if it's been pasteurized. It's been taken to a very high temp, and high temp does kill the virus. In meat, cooked meat is not going to infect you. You know, again, it
Okay.
will kill the virus. So if you're eating chicken, where you're likely to get it is when you're handling the raw chicken. So before you cook it. So the key is, the extra step. Hopefully you think your chicken, is safe and doesn't have bird flu, but as an extra step, we've always known is you can get other bacterial
Yes.
infections from raw meat and particularly raw chicken. So
Yes.
that it's just a double step up your caution there. When you're handling the raw animal, um, you basically don't want to touch your mouth, your
Hmm.
nose, your mouth. You want to wash your hands when you're done
Yes.
and be careful with that. And then and just that those practices. The virus is actually in the intestinal tract and in the lungs. And so once the bird's been cleaned, which you typically we at a grocery store, it would have already been cleaned. But
Hmm.
that doesn't mean it was cleaned in a way that there was absolutely no contamination of the meat. So you want to rinse off the meat, and
Hmm.
again, not touch your hands to your mouth while you're doing all that.
Okay. Thank you. And I think this is again important because people have also been asking me because I'm the pre-vet and they're like, "Yo, what do we do if like avian flu's on the news? Like, what are we supposed to do? You're the one who works with animals, answer questions." And I'm like, "I don't know." So thank you so much. I'm actually gonna make them listen to this. Uh,
Okay.
yes. And my last question for you actually today, which we did touch on, is what are some lessons that we could take from the COVID-19 pandemic? um, ultimately.
Well, the key thing is what we didn't do in the US. I would say there's two pieces. One is the states, the nation didn't tap into our public and private institutions like UC Davis or UC San Francisco or Stanford University Medical Center, which have worked with viruses like this all over the world. We have the laboratory capacity, we have the PCR machines.
Yes.
They have the ability, for example, to very quickly go out and test when we think there might be a new virus that's in the area before it becomes a pandemic. None of those resources were tapped into. And I would say the public-private sector wasn't coordinated, and therefore, the ability for example, to do what we call surveillance for
Yeah.
early detection. So, for example, you go back to COVID, we heard there was this new virus in China.
Mhm.
Actually, scientists there called UC Davis Veterinary Lab and asked for guidance because we had worked with Wuhan
Yeah.
Lab over the years, among other labs.
Hmm.
And so, but based on knowing there was this new virus, if we'd had this public-private a council in, say, our state of California, of experts we could have brought more resources to the effort immediately.
Hmm.
That doesn't exist. The other, so that there's many other purposes of that council in terms of both preventing and responding to an outbreak. But the other is we need to do a much bigger job at reaching out to the public, educating the public, particularly vulnerable communities, to understand what outbreak is, to understand what vaccines are. We need to build trust with the public about what are the measures
Yes.
required to prevent death in the event of an outbreak.
Hmm.
And again, that's equally important that we do that over the decades ahead, is give people the ability to make an intelligent assessment of what risks are and when they're not, and what it means to everybody to kind of cooperate when we do have an outbreak.
And I guess I mean like Dr. Jonah Mazet, I don't know if you know, yes, who that
Yeah.
is, but yeah, she's the one of the One Health directors. We've talked to her, my student organization on campus, and she's come and given a speech at her club actually. She actually told us that she was one of the first people who who like was one of the people who went to those 30 countries and swabbed a bunch of humans and animals, and that the government and UC Davis and most universities knew about coronaviruses and what they were,
Yes.
specifically this one. And it was kind of a surprise to all of us because the pandemic was not handled very well, but we all knew about it. Um, yeah.
No, that program that Jonna Mazet directed, I mean, she was a world leader based,
Mhm.
she was the director of that consortium I mentioned
Oh my
and
God.
did amazing work for, leading that team for about 12 years.
Mhm.
And basically, that program trained laboratory scientists and field scientists in these 30 countries to deal with viruses of pandemic potential. And this is before COVID. And then COVID came along in many of those countries like Cambodia and Laos and, in Africa and the Congo and elsewhere. The only reason they had adequate facilities and scientists to even deal with COVID was because they had been trained under John Mazette's leadership in that program. So yeah, she her work has led to saving thousands and
Yes.
thousands of lives.
And I didn't know that there was a lack of communication between the public and the private sector. I think when it
It's
comes to,
not just communication, they really need to collaborate and share resources and tap each other's resources. So, for example, early on in COVID, trying to do sampling and testing for we call surveillance for early detection. Um, Universities could have done that,
Mhm.
and they weren't allowed to. They weren't tapped into. For example, you could have had UCSF do the surveillance at San Francisco Airport where we thought the virus would
Yeah.
come in on the airline. You could have had UCLA do, LAX, et
Yeah.
cetera. The resources were there to do it, but they really weren't tapped into. And I think that's one of the lessons learned. And fortunately, we haven't really made the changes necessary to do that going forward yet.
Thank you so much for answering all of my questions and our questions.
Okay.
And was there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I'm pleased to be on your show. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna stop recording.
Okay.
Yes.